who shot at the police?
I think evidence is now again beyond any reasonable doubt that police were also killed by the same snipers, which were located in Maidan buildings, including far-right group of snipers.
Kiev at the beginning of 2014. Peaceful demonstrations have turned into what seemed a civil war. It's February 20th, the Bloody Thursday. On this street alone, more than 30 people died, many of whom shot by snipers and from behind. Today it remains unclear who the snipers on the rooftops surrounding the Maidan Square were. Interestingly, even though the evidence collection hadn't really started yet, the new Attorney General, Oleg Machnizki, who is a member of the right-wing Svoboda party, had already presented the final version of events to the Ukrainian parliament and the public. He announced that 12 members of the special police unit, Berkut, would be prosecuted for the murder of peaceful and unarmed protesters. He also claimed that former President Victor Yanukovych was directly responsible for the shoot-to-kill orders. So, not surprisingly, the new government stresses that the responsibility for the deadly events rests entirely with the previous administration. But some investigators directly involved in the investigation voiced their doubts about this version of events. A German TV station uncovered something incredible when they spoke with one of the prosecutor's lead investigators. He stated that the results of his investigation did not align with the version of events that came from the prosecutor's office, to put it mildly. And then there is the intercepted radio traffic between the Berkut police units that were on site that day. The intercepts make it clear that the officers were confused and surprised by the shootings, and that they frantically tried to find out where the shooters were and why they were shooting at police officers and civilians. So can it be that other shooters were involved, shooters that so far have not been identified? Why was the Attorney General not investigating despite the frustrations of his own lead investigators? These and other questions are addressed in the following interview with Ivan Katchanovski. Let's not forget, the events we are discussing today are the events that ultimately led to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and like with any other war, truth is often the first victim. Good, and here we go. Ivan Katchanovski. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, Ivan?
Yes, this is correct.
Okay, good start. Ivan, I have a whole list of your achievements in front of me. It's way too much for me to memorize, so I will briefly read what I found, right? So you're teaching at the School of Political Studies and the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. That's just the start. You're a visiting scholar at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. You're a visiting assistant professor at the Department of Politics at the State University in New York. You're a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. And you have a Kluge postdoctoral fellow, or you were a Kluge postdoctoral fellow at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. You have written multiple books, I believe 12 book chapters, I don't know how many scientific articles, right? You
18.
have appeared on... Yeah?
18.
18. You have appeared in more than 700 media outlets in more than 70 countries. I'm not going to list them all, yeah? Did I overlook anything of significance, Ivan?
I think now I have gave interviews, and my comments and publications appeared in more than 1,000, I think, media outlets in a variety of countries of the world. So, because of great interest in politics, but I can say that another important issue that I'm specialized in conflicts and in political violence in Ukraine, since I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the direction of Simon Martin Lipset, who was one of the greatest political scientists and sociologists of the all time in history, based on his citations in the United States. So this is my area of specialty, and this is very important because I'm also originally from Ukraine, and I base my comments on my basically lifetime research on these issues, specializing in conflicts in Ukraine and also researching conflicts in Ukraine for a very long time before actually they turned into such escalation, which took place during the Maidan massacre and also now with illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Okay. How long are you already in Canada?
So I came to Canada first in 2015 for postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Toronto, and afterwards I came permanently to Canada, and now I'm also Canadian since 2010.
Okay. Now I also see that, I mean, you have your own, if I can say so, theory about what happened on the Maidan, which we will explore. I saw that when Oliver Stone had the interview with President Putin, he even mentioned it, and Putin confirmed, right? You have a lot of prominent critics. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is actually a kind of this is I think I know this is kind of Wikipedia what they wrote about me, but this is kind of not correct or entirely correct information. So this is like typical Wikipedia. Anybody can write anything, and I know the person who wrote this. He is actually a kind of a person who is actually some biophysicist at the University of Michigan, and he is very active in smearing people on the internet, including on Wikipedia, including scholars and researchers of Ukraine. So he basically made up this kind of allegations or kind of a false claim that actually my theory was was supported by Putin. What happened, in fact, that I tweeted on Twitter about Israeli documentary, which interviewed some of self-admitted Georgian snipers. And this is basically their testimonies now, 7 of them publicly admitted that they were members of sniper groups on Maidan during the Maidan massacre, and that they had orders to shoot both police and protesters on orders from Maidan leadership, and that they do this along with other snipers from other countries, and including also far-right group of Ukrainian snipers. So this is basically, I use this as evidence in my studies, in addition to a variety of other evidence. But this was retweeted by Oliver Stone, who later also interviewed Putin for his documentary, I think, and Putin basically, when Oliver Stone said that, asked him about Georgian snipers, so basically Putin said that they had similar information, or that he knew already about this. So I'm not sure, again, kind of, this is just specifically made up to kind of tie into, kind of link me to Putin or Russia, because this is the only argument that they can do, tie into kind of misrepresent such connection and so on. So that's why I think it's very important to put this state, because kind of this, I did not develop this theory about Georgians. I use this as evidence along with a variety of other kind of evidence which is publicly available, and I refer to them in my new peer-reviewed article, which will be published soon in a peer-reviewed journal, peer-reviewed journal in the field. So this is just this is like small correction on this issue, but I think this is kind of a lot of information which they try to criticize me for my research is based on such kind of misrepresentation, and often deliberate misrepresentation by people like this kind of biophysicist who does this anonymously, but specifically to smear anybody who kind of does research about Ukraine and conflict in Ukraine, which is not consistent with this narrative. And he also openly whitewashes neo-Nazis and far-right, and now kind of also mass murders during Maidan. So this is their tactic.
Yeah, I think it's quite well-known knowledge that if you need scientific, verifiable information, then you can go to Wikipedia. But anything that is politically controversial is filtered and biased. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Before we go into more detail in regards to Maidan, yeah. So maybe briefly an outline. Why is it today still important to understand what happened in 2014?
I think because this is a crucial issue. This was start of the current conflict and all the conflicts which followed in Ukraine go back to Maidan massacre in 2014, and I mentioned this in my academic publications since the Maidan massacre took place. So I refer to the Maidan massacre basically as a start of this conflict and making conflict violent and turning point into Ukrainian politics and history, because it led to conflicts within Ukraine, like civil war in Donbass, and rise of separatism in Crimea, and also to conflict between Ukraine and Russia, to Russian annexation of Crimea, to Russian military interventions in Donbass in 2014, in August, and in winter 2015. And this also led to conflict between Russia and the West. And Russia dramatically escalated such conflicts last year when it invaded Ukraine and using false, basically, pretext or inflated pretexts or justifications. But this invasion was illegal under international law. But this is basically kind of origin of the current conflict and origin of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And I published about this even before the Russian invasion, because I said this is very important to prevent Russian invasion, which would be devastating to Ukraine, because it's necessary to look and understand how this conflict started. What was the origin of this conflict? And that's why Maidan massacre is crucial in this regard. And my new peer-reviewed article was specifically looking into this issue, kind of implications of the Maidan massacre for the war between Russia and Ukraine, and relations between Russia and Ukraine. But this is also very important because in addition to war between Russia and Ukraine, there is also a proxy war between the West and Russia, which is also goes back to the Maidan massacre, basically as a turning point. And also there is still ongoing civil war in Donbass, which is also goes back basically to the Maidan massacre in 2014 in Ukraine.
Yeah. There are a couple of things to be said. You packed a lot of information in a short time. Here in the West, it is often portrayed as if, Putin one morning woke up, had nothing better to do, and invaded Ukraine, right? And it is often overlooked that there is already hot war going on since 2014. I believe with 15,000 dead as a consequence, right?
Yes.
And technically, we could even look further back, in theory, even till, let's say, Gorbachev or the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? So they're interconnected events that, in combination, have led to the situation that we are facing today. One thing I think and you said it already, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal. Nobody is disputing that, right?
Yes.
But there were underlying reasons that contributed to the current situation. And for me, as behavior analyst, I'm very much interested in what it takes to get people so far to go to war with each other, even people which are as close as Ukraine and Russia. And hence my interest in the Maidan, because I agree with you. I believe there are certain events happened in those, let's say, from mid-November, right, 2013, till 18, 19, 20, 22, 22nd February of 2014. And this is where you come in. You did extensive research on exactly those events. And now I would like to hand over the microphone to you, and maybe, in a comprised form. I know we could talk about this. I have seen your research, I have seen your interviews, I have seen the own clips that you made, right? There is a lot of information. But for an audience who is not deeply informed about the topic, maybe you could outline the key events in succession that have led to the situation today.
I think based on my research, I can describe all these key events taking place, which led to the Maidan massacre on February 20th, 2014. And this conflict during the Maidan, or during the Euromaidan, started at the end of November 1913, after Yanukovych, then president of Ukraine, decided not to sign association and free trade agreement with the European Union, which he promoted before this, and he advertised as beneficial to Ukraine. But then he realized that this was not as beneficial economically to Ukraine as it was claimed. And I think he even did not read this agreement, because it was a very long agreement with thousands of pages. And I, as a scholar, I read myself this agreement. And so, in terms of reversal of his decision to sign this association and free trade agreement with the European Union, this led to protest on Maidan and on nearby areas, which was called European Square nearby. And this event was initially a peaceful event. It was a peaceful protest led by a lot of students who supported the European Union integration of Ukraine. Even so, association and free trade agreement did not involve even a prospect of European Union membership for Ukraine. And personally, I said that since I think beginning of kind of 2000, I said that the only chance for Ukraine to be a democracy and to avoid the breakup, similarly to Yugoslavia and similarly to Moldova, was for Ukraine to join the European Union, or to be on the path of European Union membership, which would require Ukraine to have democratic reforms and to respect minority rights, and would give economic incentive for people not to secede from Ukraine, as happened in Moldova, neighboring Moldova, or happened in former Yugoslavia. And I think in this case, the protest was relatively small in Ukraine, and it was basically coming to the close, because there were only few hundred remaining protesters standing on the main square on Maidan on November 30th, 2013. And suddenly there was a police, Berkut police, which moved, and they dispersed very violently this small number of protesters. They beat them, and this was kind of filmed by live television, by main television channel, and they waited. Basically, you have main television channel in Ukraine waiting on the Maidan Square, and because this happened 4 a.m. in the morning. And I was watching this live. I was watching live stream when this happened, because of time difference in Ukraine. This was not yet kind of. This was evening in Ottawa, and since I researched these issues, I was watching this live. And what you see actually, and what was shown then on this television channel, which was owned by head of administration of Yanukovych at the time, and was repeated by many other television channels in Ukraine, was actually was not a whole story. It was specifically, I think, designed to give such impression that, again, this was just violence by the police and violence against young students, basically. Even so, when I researched this event afterwards, looking into all of the footage, looking in interviews with people, including journalists who filmed this, including politicians, both from Maidan and from opposition, there is clear evidence that this dispersal by the Berkut police was specifically intended to create such reaction. It was specifically intended to create a reason for mass protest against Yanukovych in order to kind of overthrow him. And this was done by the elements of opposition, Maidan opposition, including far right. There was a right sector, which was just established, basically, and there are videos which show that the right sector members started to kind of confront police violently during this as a start of the dispersal of the protesters which took place on Maidan. But they were not filmed by any television channels. Their violence was omitted. But it was also crucial because they fled after Berkut police started to beat protesters, and they fled. The right sector basically fled to other locations in Kiev, and their leaders basically admitted that they were there, that they participated in this clashes with Berkut. So it was not just beating of protesters, but this was represented as such by the media, and next, and there were also admissions basically that this was organized with the involvement of the head of administration of Yanukovych, who was actually a member of oligarchic clan, which is which was trying to basically respond to Yanukovych attempts to seize their property, because Yanukovych tried to use his power to enrich himself and his close network of friends and family members, his son and so on, and including using oligarchs basically who became very rich as a result of political connections. So this led to mass protest in Kiev and afterwards in other regions of Ukraine. And this protest started to become violent immediately on December 1st, and they culminated in the Maidan massacre on February 20th, when almost 50 protesters were killed, along with 4 police officers. And a few days before, several dozen of other Maidan protesters were killed, along with more than 10 other police officers in Kiev and in western Ukraine. So this is event which is called Maidan Massacre, and this is a crucial event because all these protests before, which were televised by many television channels in Ukraine and in the West, they did not achieve their goal. They were not able to overthrow Yanukovych. He tried to basically placate opposition by offering them positions in the government or offering money to the right sector and to Svoboda, and because he wanted to stay in power. And for this reason, basically Maidan opposition, including far right and oligarchic opposition, they resorted to violence. They resorted to mass murder in order to overthrow Yanukovych and to blame his forces, to blame basically government forces for this mass murder, which took place in front of thousands of cameras, television cameras, and video cameras on telephones by Maidan protesters and ordinary Ukrainians. And this murder was represented as basically conducted by the government forces without any reason and on order of Yanukovych. So I researched this violence very closely. I was watching this also live when it happened on television, and it was also broadcast live on a variety of internet channels, which were from Ukrainian media and from Radio Svoboda and other cameras. And when I tried to see the same footage which I was watching live when the massacre started, I could not find any footage, any recording. They disappeared from YouTube, which was, I think, very strange, because I wanted to see evidence who actually was responsible for this massacre. And only evidence which was shown was included videos basically of police shooting with Kalashnikovs and protesters killed. But I knew location very well. I stayed many times in this area of Maidan, which is downtown Kiev. I stayed in Hotel Ukraina many times, so I knew this location very well. So I immediately saw that this footage did not match. Police shooting did not match killing of protesters. There was no footage which would show that police were shooting and protesters would be killed at the same time. But there was separate footage which basically was represented as a kind of police responsible for this murder by assumption or by implication. Even so, there was, I think, very strange that there would be no such footage which would directly link and show police basically raising their gun and making a gunshot, and then protesters would be falling to the ground. So there was no such footage, and this is, I think, was very remarkable to see, and this is why I started to question kind of why this happened and who was responsible for this. So I started writing on social media from the start of the Maidan massacre that I do not know who actually was responsible for this Maidan massacre, that it is necessary to research this. So and that's why I started to research this Maidan massacre, because I specialize in study of political violence in Ukraine. Since I wrote my doctoral dissertation, I specialize in conflicts in Ukraine, and I research all the major cases of political violence in Ukraine since the Stalinist Great Terror, and then World War II, and UN, UPA, and going then to conflicts in the former Soviet Union, violent conflict in Moldova and conflicts in Ukraine, which were not yet violent until 2014.
Okay, so if we unpeel this a little bit, and again, you have very compact information, a lot of information. If we unpeel this a little bit, yeah. So Yanukovych, same as any other politician in power, it doesn't matter if it's Trump or Putin, had a tendency and a wish, of course, to stay in power, right? We understand this. But there were also interests in the background to manipulate the situation. So I would like to start a little bit earlier and have a look what the American interests were in Ukraine, because we know that John McCain was in Ukraine, I believe, in November, right? Victoria Nuland was 5 times, according to her own statement, she was 5 times in Ukraine. We know that up until 2014, America had already invested $5 billion in Ukraine, right? So what's your take on the American interests prior to the Maidan revolution?
I think United States was interested in Ukraine because it was a key country, which was located next to Russia. So it has strategic importance for the United States. And this is why I think this would explain U.S. policy. And in 2008, then President Bush made a decision to basically...
In Bulgaria.
Yes, I think in Romania, in Bucharest, to offer Ukraine and Georgia a prospect for membership in NATO. And basically, NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008 declared that Ukraine would become a member of NATO in the future, and United States wanted to offer such prospect immediately and start negotiations for Ukraine to join NATO immediately, but there was opposition from Germany and France, and for this and some other Western European countries. So they did not offer any membership, but they said that Ukraine would become a member of NATO in the future. So this is would explain why Ukraine was so important, because it was a country, key kind of to Russia, because it was located next to Russia, and was a very significant country. Ukraine is second largest country in Europe after Russia in terms of its territory. And also it's very important because of Ukraine is major transit point for natural gas export from Russia to Western Europe, to and countries like European Union member countries like Czech Republic, Czechia, Slovakia, Austria, and many other countries located like Hungary and so on, located in Italy and also Germany before Nord Stream was built. So that's why I think United States wanted basically and support using Ukraine against Russia, kind of to contain Russian influence and to contain Russian power after Putin became kind of president. He initially tried to join NATO, but it was refused by NATO members in the United States. So there was starting to go in a conflict between Russia and West, and this conflict intensified after a decision by NATO to basically offer membership for Ukraine in the future. And Russia said, and Putin said, then specifically threatened Ukraine. He said that Ukraine is not a real country. It includes different regions or different parts, and some of them are he claimed to be Russian, or what is called Novorossiya claim. But so he basically threatened that there would be a kind of a conflict, violent conflict in Ukraine, including separatism, and that Russia might intervene in this conflict, or might even launch a war in case of future NATO membership of Ukraine. So that's why it was very important in terms of politics to kind of to prevent this conflict. But Maidan massacre, I think, was very crucial in this regard, because it during the Maidan, which started because of internal event, which I mentioned, internal events in Ukraine, but it was all linked to foreign policy, because the European Union Association was kind of refused to be signed by Yanukovych. But I think the issue was that there was now evidence that United States government, administration of President Obama started to pursue a policy of regime change in Ukraine. And basically, they tried to remove Yanukovych during Maidan using a variety of means, and they openly supported Maidan protests, and this is why McCain and other leaders,
Yeah.
I think another senator went to Ukraine, and Nuland also went to Ukraine, and they basically supported Maidan opposition, and they told Yanukovych not to use any violence, basically. And this is why protests continued for so long, because they basically told Yanukovych if he would resort to any violence by the police, basically if police would try to clear Maidan protests, he would face sanctions, and his basically his family and his own wealth and support would be, and recognition would be in danger because of retaliation from the West. So for this reason, there was confrontation taking such a long time, and this I think was expected to end without any change of the government until there was, I think, an interview which was, I think there were two interviews, very interesting interviews published by Ukrainian journalists in a Ukrainian book, which was also then published by Ukrainian media, in which they interviewed two leaders of far-right Svoboda party, which was also represented among Maidan protesters, but they were minority among Maidan protesters. And these two leaders of Svoboda party, one of whom was also deputy head of Ukrainian parliament, they said that a few weeks before Maidan massacre, they met with Western representative who told them that the policy of the West would change if the number of protesters would reach certain number. And they say that they had discussion how many protesters it would take to be basically killed, how many victims it would take for the West to change their policy and to abandon recognition of Yanukovych government. And they said that they discussed first like 5, because there already were like 3 protesters killed. So, and they said like Western representative told them 5 is not enough. So they said like 20 is not enough. So they end up with 100. So this was kind of quite remarkable, because this is like human lives. These are lives of Maidan protesters, and they discuss this like some kind of shopping or some kind of time to basically discuss what it take, how many people killed would it take for a change of government. And this is basically what this meant. This was very likely United States representative, because no other country in the world can talk on behalf of entire West. And I think this is also, I don't know the name of this person, but I think these interviews are credible because they are done separately and published by pro-Maidan Ukrainian journalists, and they were never refuted or kind of by Svoboda leaders who testify about them. And what happened actually during Maidan was exactly what was discussed during this and was mentioned during these interviews. After Maidan protesters were killed, Maidan opposition immediately declared that there was a heavily handed. So there was heavily handed of killed Maidan protesters. And this is also why immediately US policy towards the Yanukovych government changed, and they started basically saying that they immediately blame Yanukovych and his forces for massacre of Maidan protesters without any investigation. And in his memoirs, Biden, who was then vice president of the United States, he said that he called Yanukovych right after the Maidan massacre, and he told Yanukovych that his time was basically up, that this is over, and that Yanukovych has to not only leave a position of president of Ukraine, but he have basically even to leave Ukraine. And this is also quite remarkable, because kind of to say such admission, basically telling without any investigation, but basically already blaming Yanukovych and telling Yanukovych that he was responsible and that he would be basically, that he could be assassinated or that he have to leave Ukraine. And this is actually what happened, because there were, in addition to Maidan massacre, there were assassination attempts against Yanukovych. And this was confirmed by a treason trial against Yanukovych in absentia in Ukraine. There were a variety of witnesses, including first president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, who testified about such information and evidence that they knew about assassination attempts against Yanukovych. So Yanukovych fled not because he ordered this Maidan massacre, but because he was blamed for Maidan massacre by the media and by the Western governments and Ukrainian opposition, but also because of assassination attempts against him. And also, in addition to this, also President Obama, in his CNN interview he admitted that United States, basically Obama administration, managed political transition in Ukraine after Maidan massacre. So he basically admitted that the United States government was involved in the change of power in Ukraine after the Maidan massacre.
Yeah, we have a number of tapped telephone conversations also with Victoria Nuland. Yeah, but two things. Yeah, what I like to compare this Maidan situation with, especially with John McCain and Victoria Nuland, there is the 6th of January, right, where the U.S. Capitol was stormed by rioters, right? So imagine if Russian representatives would be in front of the Capitol and, steering the protesters to riot the Capitol. That's how I compare John McCain and Victor Nuland being there in Ukraine. Yeah, but one thing that's really difficult to understand here in the West, right? And you briefly scratched on it, yeah? First of all, NATO extension, because many people say there's no relation between what happens in the Ukraine right now and NATO enlargement, right? And as a consequence, the context is disregarded, right? So William Burns, the current CIA director, has stated in his memoirs about 2 years ago, and he was U.S. ambassador in Russia for I don't know how many years. Yeah, he stated that he knew that the NATO extension to Georgia and Ukraine is the reddest of red lines, not only for Putin but for his whole inner circle. Right? From your perspective, in regards to the NATO enlargement, how do you explain this to people who claim there's no relation whatsoever between NATO expansion and the current situation in Ukraine and Russia?
I think the issue is more complex because I analyze this issue in my peer-reviewed publication, peer-reviewed article, and in my own research, even before Maidan. And I think this issue was a real issue, that NATO membership was a real issue. And I mentioned a statement by Putin in 2008 that who threatened basically West and Ukraine with a conflict, open conflict, and even backup with Russian involvement, and this is, I think, was very dangerous for this reason. But there is another issue. So this was NATO expansion was a real issue, again, which was used by Russia to justify its invasion of Ukraine, or illegal invasion of Ukraine. But there was, according to my research and according to all the evidence which I examined and publicly available evidence, there was no real prospect of Ukraine becoming member of NATO in the foreseeable future. So chances of Ukraine becoming member of NATO, like in the next 20 years, for instance, were close to zero. And this is why Russia basically kind of inflated this threat from NATO membership, because it was not immediate. Because Russia claims that they launched invasion of Ukraine, which they call special military operation, to basically prevent this danger of Ukraine becoming member of NATO and prevent, like other issues, like prevent Ukraine becoming nuclear power, or prevent Ukraine from launching military kind of takeover of Donbass. But this was all these kind of threats were basically inflated. There were real issues, like NATO membership was a real issue, but prospect, but it was not immediate. There was no real chance of NATO membership. But I think there was another issue, that even so Ukraine was not a member of NATO, there was a close cooperation between NATO countries and Ukraine after Maidan, including training of Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian supplies of weapons and other kind of relations. There was a deployment of military kind of personnel and advisors from Western countries in Ukraine, specifically to provide support for Ukrainian forces during war in Donbass. And Putin also claimed that this was dangerous because if there would be NATO missiles or US missiles deployed in Ukraine, it would be a very short time for them to reach Russia or to reach Moscow. but actually there was no any evidence that there were any plans for the West to deploy missiles in Ukraine or to deploy nuclear weapons. So this is again another example when Russia basically justified use such kind of real issues to justify, but inflated issues to a very strong extent. They inflated them to justify the invasion of Ukraine. And I think this is tragedy because I wrote this before the Russian invasion, that there was a real possibility of such invasion. This was a real danger based on my own analysis. And the only way for Ukraine, which was, I think, a very easy way and would have been very beneficial for Ukraine to prevent such conflict and to prevent such war, which has very devastating consequences for Ukraine, as we can see now, was for Ukraine to agree to be a neutral country, to basically renounce NATO membership, which in any case there was no real possibility of such membership in the near future or immediate future and or kind of foreseeable future. And for this meant that Ukraine would not sacrifice a lot of real issues. This was not a major kind of concession to Russia to basically to say that you can become a neutral country, because in such case NATO membership was not a real and a prospect of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO were not likely. But I think in exchange for this, if Ukraine could have been offered membership prospect for European Union, that this would give Zelensky basically and Western countries another opportunity, basically to, instead of NATO membership, to focus on European Union membership. In such case, I think this would have been a win-win to also to Ukraine and to the West, and which would have prevented this war, which could have been easily prevented. But now I think it's too late, and in such case, I think it's very damaging because of such opportunities which were lost.
So, if I understood you correctly, you said that neither potential NATO enlargement nor the potential placement of NATO nuclear weapons were the reasons for Putin to invade Russia. If I understood you correctly, you said instead it was the closer integration between the European Union that may have caused him to invade?
No. I think there was this NATO membership and military deployment of NATO military personnel and advisors and military weapons was inflated by Russia. So this was real issues. They were real issues, but they were inflated or greatly exaggerated in terms of importance and in terms of possibility by Russia. So that's why Russian invasion is not justified, because preventive war can be only justified if there is immediate threat of, for instance, of military threat or danger and so on. But there was no such danger, immediate danger of Ukraine becoming a NATO member or deployment of NATO missiles or US missiles on Ukrainian territory. But in case of European Union membership, Russia did not object to European Union membership of Ukraine at the time, and still after Russian invasion, they still did not object this. So this is why I offered as a kind of peace plan to resolve this conflict before it started and soon after it started. I offered basically kind of a deal which would make Ukraine a neutral country, and in exchange, European Union would give Ukraine prospect for European Union membership. So in such case, and Russia would have been agreed to such a deal, and this could have prevented this war or ended this war as soon as it started.
Yeah. So we come back to neutrality in a moment, because I'm aware that neutrality was on the table. Putin was actually asking for neutrality, and my understanding is that Zelensky at the beginning was also positive in regards to neutrality. But before we go there, one more time. So if NATO expansion and the related consequences thereof were not the reason for, and I agree with you, it was exaggerated and inflated, yeah? But if that were not the reasons, then what was the reason for Putin to invade Ukraine?
I think he said in some of his interviews that basically he regarded it's better to start himself. Basically, if there is a fight, he said it's better always to start yourself first,
Okay.
not to respond. And this is why he basically he justifies this for himself as that sometimes in the future Ukraine might become there would be a possibility of Ukraine becoming a real possibility of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, or there will be a possibility of deployment of of NATO weapons and so on. And this is why I think they wanted to to launch this invasion at the time when there was still possibility or open window, and this would be unexpected, because later he believed that this might have been in a disadvantage for Russia because of closer cooperation between NATO and Ukraine. So I think this is like his justification for this, and I think another reason was that there was a failure of Minsk agreement to resolve this conflict or war in Donbass.
Yeah, so you say something very important here, which is on my list, the Minsk agreements, because since a couple of weeks, since a couple of weeks we know, based on statements from Angela Merkel and President Hollande, that they used the Minsk agreement, that there never was an intent to implement both Minsk 1 and 2. They were just there to stall for time to allow Ukraine the military buildup needed in order to deal with any conflict between Russia. What's your take on this?
Yes, I think that's consistent with my own analysis. I do not see any readiness of the Ukrainian government or Western governments to implement the Minsk agreements. And these Minsk agreements were signed by Ukrainian government and by the West and by Russia after Russian military interventions in Donbass. So the first covert Russian military intervention took place in August of 2014, and this led to first Minsk agreement. And then after second Russian military intervention in February and January of 2015, there was a second Minsk agreement signed, because at the time Ukrainian forces were basically defeated and encircled by Russian forces, which included like several battalions basically, and they were deployed covertly without Russia admitting this. And there was a real possibility of Russia taking control back to separatists of Mariupol, which was initially at the time was taken by separatists basically under their control, but then was taken back by Ukrainian forces, including Azov regiment, neo-Nazi Azov regiment, and so for this reason, Russia then had military advantage compared to Ukrainian forces, and for this reason, I think Poroshenko and then and Western governments, they wanted basically to sign Minsk agreement in order to prevent further loss of Ukraine at the time, because then Ukrainian forces were much weaker compared to 2022. So I think this is consistent with the evidence, and I think Putin basically pressured for Ukraine and for the West to accept Minsk agreements, because he wanted to use Minsk agreement to maintain control over Ukrainian politics and in particular foreign policy, because this agreement would have offered de facto autonomy for Donbass, separatist regions of Donbass, and also it would meant that they would have ability to block any NATO membership of Ukraine or any kind of cooperation between Ukraine and NATO, military cooperation, and this would have meant that again Ukraine would de facto become a confederate state, or with a very large de facto semi-independent republics in Donbass, which were not recognized at the time by Russia, but supported by Russia militarily, politically, and economically.
Yeah, Putin has said on multiple occasions throughout the years that we, the West, cannot be trusted. Right now, the example of the Minsk Accords, which were done on the highest governmental levels, right, on state and nation levels, and where now, in retrospect, the leaders of those countries, of France and Germany, say they never intended these agreements to be implemented with a specific aim, to bolster Ukraine in the meantime. And going even further back, where Putin mentioned on several occasions the fact that when the Berlin Wall fell and Russia gave back Eastern Germany without a single shot fired, vis-a-vis was the promise for NATO not to expand an inch into Soviet insulosphere. Yeah. Now, many people in the West say that never happened, right? I checked it out on the security archive of the Washington State University. It's all there, declassified informations. So is there an argument in your point of view if Putin claims the West cannot be trusted? Is that a valid argument?
I think there was another very, very kind of relevant issue is that after the Maidan massacre, there was agreement signed by Maidan opposition and by Yanukovych with presence and with signatures of foreign ministers of France, Germany, and Poland. And this agreement basically offered peaceful resolution to conflict in Ukraine after Maidan massacre by offering early elections, presidential elections, in Ukraine, and this would have an investigation of Maidan massacre by international bodies, in this case Council of Europe, and withdrawal of forces, of government forces from Kiev, and also from downtown Kiev, and also disarmament of Maidan opposition. So there was a real possibility of peaceful resolution of this conflict, which could have prevented all these subsequent conflicts which took place in Ukraine. But this agreement was immediately kind of not implemented by the Maidan opposition because they used military force and threats to take power in Ukraine after Maidan massacre. And for this reason, there was also no investigation, and nobody from Western governments, even so they signed such agreement, they never kind of even mention this agreement now. So this is, I think, another example when such agreement might have been signed specifically to not in good faith. So this was not real interest in offering a peaceful resolution of Maidan conflict, but they wanted simply to basically to create such agreement. And also, I think this and both Yanukovych and Putin, they mentioned also that there was a promise by Obama that the Maidan opposition would withdraw from Kiev as well, their armed forces, but this also did not happen. I think this is one of the reasons why I think it's now very difficult would be to make agreement, any political agreement to end this war in Ukraine, because because of this past attack, when a lot of agreements which were not implemented because they were never fulfilled, and they were signed just as a part of a just for political reasons, in order to buy time or in order to create such impression. And I think there is clear evidence that there was a promise not to have, even it was not written promise, but there was clear statements by the West that Western leaders, that they would not expand NATO. And again, this agreement was broken, and the same applies to Maidan massacre and to Minsk agreements. And I think this is just clear example of now Western policy, because they regard themselves as that they won the Cold War. And basically, they believe that Russia was defeated during the Cold War, and that's why there was no longer any need to obey any international agreements, because Russia was weak and Western countries won. United States was leading the world, and for this reason, why to basically commit to anything which would be which would take into which would again agree to some kind of concessions when it was possible, just to disregard them and just based on their own self-interest. And I think this is what happened, because it was not in the interest of Western countries or the United States to to obey such agreements, and this is why they do not obey them, and because they regarded Ukraine as a tool against Russia, and this is why such a policy was pursued, and diplomacy is actually now and then was just what is called Potemkin window dressing, just to create a impression that everything is fine and there is a potential for a peaceful resolution, but this is not the case.
Yeah. And when we come now specifically to what happened in the background, according to your research on Maidan, so here in the West, the impression is that you had a popular, it's called Maidan revolution. You had a popular revolution, and that the government from Yanukovych shot apparently both on protesters and on police, right? So what's the quintessence of your research to the specific backstory in regards to the Maidan revolution, especially those critical days from the 18th to the 22nd of February 2014.
Yes, I examined this issue in my studies. I recently presented a paper, my study, at the annual meeting of American Political Science Association in Montreal, in which I examined how we can classify Maidan. And according to my research, this was a complex phenomenon which included elements of mass protest, which I mentioned there was popular protest against Yanukovych government, and most of protesters came from my native western Ukraine and from also central Ukraine and Kiev, but there was a strong opposition to Maidan in the east and in the south of Ukraine. And in addition to this, there was also element of revolution in this case, but it was mostly like far-right revolution because this revolutionary movement was led by far-right organizations like Svoboda and right sector, and even the name of Revolution of Dignity, which is used to as a name for Maidan or Euromaidan, actually was coined by a deputy of Svoboda, far-right Svoboda party, which was originally named Social National Party after basically National Socialist Party of Germany, and they became more moderate during Maidan, but relatively moderate, but they still were a far-right party, and this is why the name Revolution is Revolution of Dignity is a kind of name which is a political name and it does not represent actually what happened. And I think I already mentioned evidence of regime change. United States led regime change policy in Ukraine during Maidan, but there was also, I think, the key element was Maidan massacre, which can be considered to be consistent with a coup, according to classification, because it was conducted by a small number of people. It was not a protesters entire Maidan opposition or Maidan protesters who conducted Maidan massacre. It was only a small number of people who just decided to took power by using mass killing of protesters and the police. And according to my research, which I examined again and published and presented in major academic venues, there is now beyond any reasonable doubt that this massacre was conducted not by Yanukovych forces or on his order, but that this massacre was conducted by elements of the Maidan opposition from the oligarchic and far-right parties. And this was specifically done to seize power in Ukraine by blaming the Yanukovych government and his forces for this mass murder. And my evidence is based on all publicly available information. So I examined all major videos of this Maidan massacre, or I think all publicly available videos of the Maidan massacre in different languages, including German, from German television, from many other languages, from Scandinavian countries, from Ukraine, from Belgium, very interesting video from Belgium, which was revealed by Maidan massacre trial. I examined also testimonies and other evidence given during Maidan massacre trial in Ukraine, which was never reported by any major Western media. So I examined this evidence, testimonies from Maidan protesters. I examined testimonies of other witnesses and forensic examinations which are conducted by government experts. And all this evidence tells us and tells me, and which I examine and shows beyond any reasonable doubt that this massacre was conducted not by the police or government snipers, but it was conducted by Maidan snipers who were shooting both police and protesters from buildings which are controlled by Maidan opposition, like Hotel Ukraina and other buildings in this area. And this is supported by videos. There are like 10 videos of Maidan snipers in the Hotel Ukraina shooting into Maidan protesters. This was filmed by videos. These videos are from like BBC video. There is a CNN video which they never reported, but you can see voices of Maidan group of Maidan snipers looking for shooting positions, but it was never reported, translated from Ukrainian. But you can hear such voices. You can also there was also Spinnet television video, ICTV Ukrainian television channel video, which shows that protesters were killed from the same room in the Hotel Ukraina in the back during Maidan massacre, and this room was occupied by one of the leaders of Svoboda party, far-right Svoboda party. And this is the same exactly window which was filmed, which BBC journalists filmed in this video, a sniper was shooting from this window of Hotel Ukraina into Maidan protesters and into BBC crew. And after they ran away, one of Ukrainian protesters who was filmed in this BBC video, he testified at the Maidan massacre trial that he was told by other Maidan protesters that this was our sniper. So this sniper was our sniper, and he was also testified that afterwards he saw that there was another sniper in another window of Hotel Ukraina who raised his rifle and told basically and gave signs to Maidan protesters not to make any fuss about or not to point into snipers in the Hotel Ukraina. And this is another evidence that this was they were Maidan snipers, not just any. There is no evidence that there were any government snipers or anybody else in the Hotel Ukraina, any third force, but only evidence suggests that they were Maidan opposition snipers, specifically from this far-right link special Maidan company. And Georgian several military snipers also testified that they were in the Hotel Ukraina. Some of them were in the Hotel Ukraina, and they shot police and they shot protesters from the Hotel Ukraina, and they shot police from another building which was located on Maidan. So this is like consistent with also forensic examinations by forensic government experts who found that absolute majority, almost all of Maidan protesters were shot not from the front and horizontal position, because Berkut police was located on the ground in front of them and was filmed shooting into, again, direction of the protesters. And this is what I mentioned. I saw these videos, but they did not show that police shot Maidan protesters, but it was represented as such. But actually, they forensic examinations by medical experts from the government investigation found that Maidan protesters were shot not from the front, from horizontal positions, but from a very steep or very high angle from the back or from the side, left and right side, which is exactly matches location of buildings which are controlled by opposition, including Hotel Ukraina in the back on the side of Maidan protesters. And in addition to this, the absolute majority of wounded Maidan protesters who were wounded during Maidan massacre, they testified at the Maidan massacre trial and investigation in Ukraine that they were shot by snipers in the Hotel Ukraina, or that they witnessed snipers in this building or nearby buildings. So this is kind of just evidence. Even if people who were wounded testify about this, about snipers in the Hotel Ukraina, that they were shot from the Hotel Ukraina, and the government investigation did not investigate any snipers there. They basically denied that there were any snipers in these buildings. Even so, you have videos, you have kind of testimonies, you have forensic examinations, but government investigation claims that there were no snipers. So this is like the most lame and most primitive cover-up, because now how you can do this? And even after these Georgians publicly admitted that they were among members of sniper groups, they offered to testify to the Maidan massacre trial, and they are kind of and to the prosecution, general prosecutor office in Ukraine, but they first refused to do this, and then their testimony was admitted. They testified via video link in Belarus before Russian invasion. They testified to prosecutor general office investigation, and one of their testimonies was admitted and shown at the Maidan massacre trial as evidence. And basically they confirmed that this were real people, real identities. They were not actors or not just fake people making fake claims. They actually had a real name. Their names were real, that they were in Ukraine before Maidan massacre. This was confirmed by one of by Ukrainian bodyguard service, that one of the snipers who testified actually was in Ukraine shortly before Maidan massacre, and they testified that they entered Ukraine during the Maidan using false documents without any border check. So there was no such evidence presented, but they testified that they did not cross the border, that their passport, they were helped by Maidan opposition members to cross border without any document check. So there was no border stops, and this is like, this was used as evidence that they were never in Ukraine. And even German fact check with this ARD television claimed that they actually were never in Ukraine, that this person was never in Ukraine because he was supposed to be in jail. But actually, Maidan massacre trial revealed that he was actually in Ukraine, confirming his testimony shortly before Maidan massacre. And he said that then he was looking, even before Maidan started, he said he was looking for shooting positions on the Maidan, specifically for sniper positions, because he was sniper in Georgian military. And this is just one example. This is kind of evidence. There is also very interesting German documentary. Sorry, not a German documentary, but a German footage which was filmed by ARD for ARD television channel, public television channel in Germany. And this footage was never released, never made public. But it was shown briefly at the Maidan massacre trial after kind of it was sent by mail to some of to Maidan victims' lawyers, and this footage had no sound, which was quite amazing to see that this footage would have no sound from German television, kind of until the very start. And this was, I think, was very crucial footage, which I think would have immediately shown how this Maidan massacre happened and why there was no sound. Is because this video was filmed by an operator who was working for this German public television station from a room in the Hotel Ukraina, which was occupied by another German television company, ZDF. And they admitted this. This was a room on the 14th floor, and there are videos of Maidan snipers shooting from this room into the direction of Maidan protesters. So this is like basically, and he said on social media, this Ukrainian journalist who filmed this video for ARD at the time when he was working for this German television, that this video was much longer. It had sound, but he said that this German television refused to to provide this video even to investigation, Ukrainian investigation, government investigation. Even I think this is quite unprecedented because the video shows, I think, very clearly shows both police shooting, police location in front of Maidan protesters and protesters getting killed. And it's possible to see immediately, which I analyzed in my own analysis, in my own papers. I analyzed this video and along of other videos, which are synchronized very perfectly, according to sound from Maidan stage. And this analysis, only videos show beyond any doubt that the times when police were shooting, making gunshots, and the direction of gunshots in which police were shooting did not coincide with times when specific protesters were killed and or wounded, or in direction of gunshots from that time. So this meant basically police were shooting above Maidan protesters. They were shooting into Hotel Ukraina because snipers were located there, and not on the level of Maidan protesters who were in blind zone, because police were shooting from beyond big barricade with Maidan tanks. And also, I think they were shooting in the ground and in trees and electric poles just to stop advance of Maidan protesters. But there is no, just in few cases, the times of gunshots coincide in the videos and the times when specific protesters were killed or wounded. But at the same time, you can hear other gunshots from very different sound, very remote, which sound was even much closer, which was location of Hotel Ukraina, or much farther, which suggests that there were other snipers who were shooting at the time. So even videos, even basic analysis of videos, which I did for my own research, shows beyond any reasonable doubt that Maidan protesters were not killed by Berkut, because video showed that they were not shooting at the time when specific protesters were killed in the videos. They were not shooting into these protesters. They were not even making gunshots in almost all cases. So it's not possible to kill somebody without aiming, massacre somebody without aiming a gun into them, or like a Kalashnikov into their direction, and then making gunshot. because if there is somebody killed like in the next 2 minutes, so this means it's not possible to do this. And the same videos which were synchronized by other companies, like by New York company, architecture company, which was kind of used as evidence that they were also shot Maidan protesters by the Berkut police, but they never show any evidence that this happened at the same time. And actually they misrepresented wound locations of protesters which were killed, 3 protesters. And this report was published by New York Times as clear kind of evidence that Maidan protesters were killed by Berkut police. Even so, just basic look into forensic medical examination shows that wound locations was changed very significantly to make them horizontal from a very steep location and to move them to the front from side. So this is like basic, this is most primitive fabrication, and this was done by the New York Times as given kind of very wide publicity for this New York architecture company, which had no expertise in any forensics, but they claim that they did this for Maidan massacre trial in Ukraine, but Maidan massacre trial never admitted this as evidence. So this is just one example. So I think evidence is beyond any reasonable doubt. And now you have also more than 500 witnesses testifying about Maidan snipers, about involvement of specific Maidan leaders in the Maidan massacre. And there is no evidence of any order by Yanukovych or by his ministers or commanders of massacre Maidan protesters.
Mm-hmm. So just to explain to the public, Berkut is a police unit, right? I think the Berkut unit, they had these yellow armbands. That's the unit we are talking about, and they were initially accused of shooting, again, paradoxically, both the protesters and the police, right? But apparently there are some background information that you have just explained in regards to the protesters who killed the protesters. But I'm still wondering, Ivan, who killed the police forces? Who shot at the police?
I think evidence is now again beyond any reasonable doubt that police were also killed by the same snipers, which were located in Maidan buildings, including far-right group of snipers. And this evidence, like videos, which show that there was shooting into the direction of the police on the Maidan. In the early morning of Maidan massacre, there was shooting from Music Conservatory and so from the Hotel Ukraina. And this is where, when police started to fall to the ground and became wounded, and many of them were wounded, several dozens of them were wounded. There is also very interesting footage which was never shown by CNN, which I got them from their archive. And this is online archive which is publicly available. So this footage shows a group of Maidan protesters from this far-right Maidan Special Armed Company of Maidan protesters who were based in the Music Conservatory going next to journalists from CNN, next to Maidan stage, in front of CNN journalists who giving kind of basically live coverage of Maidan protest, and they walk near him with rifles, with hunting rifles, with other rifles. They go to barricade in which Maidan protesters were kind of taking cover and confronting with Molotov cocktails and other kind of in other ways Berkut police, but there was no killing of Berkut police at that time, kind of when this Molotov cocktails were thrown. But then you can see very loud gunshots, and then there is another video which shows that there was another protester who got Kalashnikov type of rifle, kind of assault rifle, or maybe hunting version of Kalashnikov, and this is coincides with the time when police were killed and wounded on the Maidan massacre. And according to government investigation, they found that policemen on the Maidan were killed from these directions of Maidan. Controlled buildings like Music Conservatory, and also from a direction of Maidan stage, which is consistent with videos. And in addition to this, there were admissions, public admissions by several members of this Maidan self-defense company, Maidan company, which was linked to right sector, who testified in BBC documentary. They testified in Ukrainian media and to government investigation, which was also leaked, that they and their other members of their company who were based in the hotel in the music conservatory, they shot police. So they admitted this publicly. And afterwards, only afterwards, government investigation started to investigate them, but still nobody is arrested of them, even so they publicly admitted this shooting and killing policemen on the Maidan. Nobody is arrested. There is no investigation, basically, and this investigation was done separately from again, investigation of Maidan's killing of Maidan protesters. Even so, this has happened almost immediately, and this happened basically at the same time and shortly before Maidan protesters were killed. And one of them also, there is like video of shooting of one of policemen was shot, and there is, you can see also video at the same time Maidan protester raising his hunting rifle, and this is making gunshot, and the action of this policeman who is then shot and killed. And this is like there are no such evidence from any Berkut police during the Maidan massacre killing in such a way, or evidence which would support that they killed Maidan protesters, because there were gunshots from other directions as well in just few cases. And I think there is also very interesting evidence which was never reported by any media, that before the massacre started in the morning around 6 a.m. on February 20th, there were 2 rooms which were occupied by German ARD television journalists in Hotel Ukraina. They were shot at. And one German female producer from this television channel, ARD television channel, she said in an interview that she was lucky because she was going to bed and a bullet flew above her head in the Hotel Ukraina. And she pointed bullet location. And but this was only the coverage which at the time, and they basically blame government snipers for shooting into German journalists. What was not reported actually is that after this investigation, government investigation, forensic experts came, and they immediately found from this bullet location and a bullet hole in the window, in the Hotel Ukraina window of this room, that this bullet direction directly pointed to main post office, which was occupied at the time by the right sector. This was headquarters of the right sector, which is like far-right organization, and they pointed to the location of basically 2 gunshots, which almost killed German television producer from ARD public television. But ARD television never reported this. And another room, which was also occupied by German television journalists, also had the same gunshot and location, which also pointed to the same location of main post office or nearby music conservatory, which was also occupied, as I mentioned, by Maidan snipers from this self-defense company. But this was never reported. So this is actually, they started shooting journalists even before they started shooting police. But this again, evidence was never reported by even so. Journalists, Western journalists, German journalists were the same ones who were targeted by Maidan snipers. I think, but they claim falsely that these were government snipers who shot at them when they first reported this.
So, concluding, and with the knowledge of your overall research, who was behind these shootings and why? And I don't mean the snipers, maybe even the Gregorian coming from Gregoria. I don't necessarily mean the far right, right? But who was really behind, or at least partially behind, the tragedy that happened in February 2014? Which interest groups? The final interest groups, yeah? So yes, you have snipers, they were paid. I saw some interviews, I understand. Yes, you have far right, yeah? But who was really behind, from your perspective?
I rely on my analysis only on evidence and only publicly available evidence. So I cannot say actually who gave order to massacre Maidan protesters, who was actually kind of organizer of this Maidan massacre by name or by their affiliation, because there is no such kind of publicly available information. So I cannot say this, but I know that there was involvement of Maidan leadership elements, from Maidan opposition, from Fatherland Party at the time, and also from right sector and Svoboda. So this is like evidence, and there is also evidence of involvement of Georgian also former leaders of Georgian government and also Georgian snipers. But I think I did not find any evidence of involvement of any other foreign country like Russia or any other United States or any other government directly involved in the Maidan massacre. So there is no such involvement, but I cannot say, because again a lot of evidence is not yet publicly available. So I think this big issue needs to be answered, and it's necessary to identify those who were actually responsible for this Maidan massacre, who gave order to massacre Maidan protesters and so on. But based on publicly available information, I think it will be very difficult to do this, because it's necessary to conduct investigation actually on site and look into evidence and examine evidence, which is for me as political scientist, this is different kind of methodology and different kind of task, because for me most important was to determine which party of the conflict was responsible for this. And I can say that there is clear evidence beyond any reasonable doubt about the involvement of elements of Maidan oligarchic opposition and leadership and far-right opposition and leadership in this Maidan massacre. And I think they mentioned some names, some Maidan leaders are mentioned by testimonies of Maidan protesters and by Maidan witnesses, and I think this is credible testimony. And they mentioned top leaders of a new government which came to power in Ukraine immediately after Maidan, and which took senior positions, and top leaders of right sector and so on as involved in the Maidan massacre. So I think this is what I can say. But I think still there are a lot of information still which need to be investigated and to determine if there was any other involvement. For instance, from I don't see there would be any evidence of direct involvement, but maybe indirect involvement. As I mentioned, this testimony about Western representative telling Maidan Svoboda party leaders that they needed 100 protesters killed or victims for change of policy towards Yanukovych government. So I think it still needs to be investigated, but I doubt that this would happen anytime soon. But I think in any case, I think there would be likely to be more revelations about actual people who were involved in this Maidan massacre, which is I think a crucial event to understand conflict in Ukraine and how to resolve this conflict peacefully, because without doing this it will be very difficult to achieve such a resolution. Because Russia, in addition to claiming about NATO membership and other reasons which I mentioned, Russia also specifically mentioned Maidan and Maidan massacre as one of the reasons why they invaded Ukraine, because they claim that Ukraine is, they falsely claim that Ukraine is a Nazi state or Nazi regime. After Maidan, that this was fascist coup and so on. So Russia basically inflated also a role of far-right in Ukraine, and they misrepresented also Maidan. Maidan as fascist coup to justify their invasion of Ukraine, but there was real evidence of involvement of far-right in the Maidan massacre. But again, this was not only far-right, and they, in addition to neo-Nazis, they were also like radical nationalist organizations involved in this massacre.
Yeah. And lastly, do you think the current government of Ukraine does sufficient or puts sufficient effort in investigating what happened in Maidan?
No, I think they they did nothing, I think, to investigate any of the Maidan events and Maidan massacre. And I think this is also a big tragedy of Zelensky, because when he campaigned for president of Ukraine, he specifically during debates on with Poroshenko, which were televised debates, and Zelensky basically confronted Poroshenko, who was then president of Ukraine and one of Maidan leaders, and saying basically that there was no investigation of Maidan massacre. So he basically faulted Poroshenko for failing to investigate Maidan massacre. But after he came to power, Zelensky completely abandoned his election promises of peace and even promised to investigate Maidan massacre. He never did this, and I think he just continues to using the same narrative that this Maidan protesters were killed by Yanukovych forces, and there is no real investigation taking place of any evidence. And I think it now will be very difficult to conduct such investigation because of the war. And I think I'm quite skeptical that Zelensky would be willing to do this, because for him it's not beneficial. He actually uses this Maidan massacre also to as one of justifications for his policies and to his even before Russian invasion, which became even more extreme than policies of Poroshenko, whom he opposed during elections, but after elections, Zelensky became what I call even Poroshenko on steroids, and he abandoned all his agreements and became even more kind of extreme in many cases. And I think this is one of also failures of his policy, because Russia used these policies of Zelensky and his failure to kind of to achieve peaceful resolution of this conflict, and peaceful implementation of Minsk agreements, and to again to kind of investigate Maidan massacre and Odessa massacre and so on, to justify its illegal invasion of Ukraine by falsely claiming that Ukraine is a Nazi state, and even so Zelensky is not a Nazi and his government is not a Nazi. But I think it's very crucial, because I think he is afraid, Zelensky was afraid to be targeted by the far right if he would investigate Maidan massacre, or if he would investigate Odessa massacre, and he tried to placate far right by basically giving them immunity from any persecution, and this actually became now kind of openly done, because after the Russian invasion, there is no real investigation of anybody responsible for Maidan massacre and for other crimes, specifically from the far right or members of Maidan opposition. And I think this is, very kind of tragic, because for Ukraine to become a real democracy, or to become a democratic country, to be based on the rule of law and to based on human rights, I think without investigating Maidan massacre, this would not be possible. And I think I'm very skeptical in this regard. And I think another issue is that Western governments, they never never insisted on any investigation of Maidan massacre. And I think this is also very important, because Zelensky is, and Ukraine became a client state of the United States after Maidan. So basically, United States and other Western countries have a very strong involvement in formulation or information of Ukrainian government, in policies of Ukrainian government, including investigation of specific investigations, but they never insisted on this. And I think this is, also a big tragedy for Ukraine, because of failure to achieve justice had not only consequences, negative consequences for people who were killed, because many victims of Maidan massacre, both from police and protesters, never got any justice. Their families never got justice, but also because Maidan massacre led to such devastating consequences for Ukraine and Ukrainians, which I mentioned, like civil war in Donbass, Russian military interventions in Crimea and Donbass, Russian annexation of Crimea, and finally this culminated in illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is just a drastic escalation of the conflict, which started with the Maidan massacre in Ukraine. And I think this is a very big tragedy for Ukraine and many other people in other countries, because they are affected by this conflict.
Yeah. I have one last question for you, Ivan. Based on your estimation, what's next? Where are we going with this? The overall Ukraine-Russian situation. Will NATO get involved? There will be, I heard, a spring offensive either from Ukraine or from Russia. What's next?
I think it's difficult to predict war, because I think, again, anything can happen, but I don't think that NATO would intervene directly, because there would be real danger of a war between Russia and NATO, and this would mean a possibility, real danger of a nuclear war between Russia and NATO, which would, I think, kind of would mean even end of the humanity with kind of as civilization, because of devastating consequences of such a war between nuclear powers, because Russia is still a major nuclear power in the world, and such a war would be just kind of beyond any kind of would have effect which would go beyond anything which happened so far. And for this reason, I expect that there will be no such direct military intervention by NATO countries in Ukraine, but there is such possibility, because I think that based on my analysis, Ukraine would not be able to defeat Russia. So promises of that Ukraine would be able to defeat Russia militarily and take back control over separatist-controlled Donbass or Crimea, which was annexed by Russia, are close to zero. Basically, chances of doing this are close to zero, because Russia still has military advantage over Ukraine, even after supply of unprecedented amount of military hardware, weapons, and financial and economic aid, and military aid, intelligence, and advice to Ukrainian forces. Still, Russia maintain a military advantage over Ukraine, and even if Ukraine tried to take back Crimea, which was annexed by Russia, Russia can always resort to nuclear weapons or threat of use of nuclear weapons in such case. So that's why I do not expect this is going to happen. But in terms of military developments, I think there was promise by Zelensky and his Minister of Defense and other Ukrainian officials and by Western governments of a new offensive in Ukraine by Ukrainian forces in this month, maybe, or maybe next month, if when weather would improve, using Western new weapons like tanks, including from Germany, Leopards, and from other Western countries, and so on. But I don't think that this offensive might be a turning point into this war, because, as I mentioned, Russia has still military advantage. So it would, so any offensive would still kind of would not defeat Russia, and the question only becomes how much territory Ukraine would be able to gain back from which are occupied by Russia or annexed by Russia now, or how much territory Russia would be able to take back again after Ukrainian offensive, or to occupy and annex during this war. And I think the bigger issue is also amount of casualties, because I think now Russian strategy is focusing on attrition of Ukrainian forces, using their advantage in artillery, and so the number of casualties of Ukrainian forces now very large, in particular in Bakhmut area, and I think this might have effect which will be also very devastating for Ukraine, because number of casualties is very large, and Russia has advantage in terms of number of mobilized forces it can use against Ukraine, and Ukraine is not able to match military kind of personnel, number of mobilized forces, and there is now kind of much less willingness by many Ukrainians to serve in military, because of a lot of videos which show that they are recruited by force and so on, and a number of kind of people who are volunteers to join Ukrainian forces is now much smaller compared to the start of the war. So in this regard, I'm very skeptical about future of Ukraine, because in any case, the best scenario for Ukraine would be to have a status quo, or very close to status quo, like North Korea scenario. But I think this will not be realistic, because in this case the conflict can resume any time afterwards, and Russia still might try to achieve their goals, and even in such case of stalemate, Russia would be able to keep annexed regions of Kherson region and Zaporizhia region, maybe entire territories which they annexed, or territories which are they able to occupy right now. So in such cases, again, or territories which they are able also including in Donbass. So I think in any case Ukraine would lose very, very significant kind of military losses, civilian losses, which are again growing as well, and in addition to this there would be a very large devastating to Ukrainian economies, and a large number of Ukrainians left Ukraine. So I'm very pessimistic about future of Ukraine, even if Ukraine would be managed to to survive militarily and to achieve a kind of standstill with Russia. This will be, I think, best scenario for Ukraine, but I think still it will be a kind of best of the worst possible outcomes, because Ukraine, the possibility of defeating Russia by Ukraine is close to zero, and I think for this reason I'm quite skeptical, because in the case of such a deal, or basically peaceful resolution of conflict, or in the case of even stalemate, there would be a very likely possibility of unrest in Ukraine. In particular, the Zelensky power might come under threat from the far-right opposition and from some other radical forces in Ukraine, including from Poroshenko opposition and other ones, who would blame Zelensky basically for the failure to defeat Russia, and his power he may be even overthrown So this may be, again, a new kind of possibility, which will be, again, very dangerous for Ukraine, because Russia can use this internal kind of conflict in Ukraine and try to put a pro-Russian government, or change regime in Ukraine into pro-Russian one from pro-Western one, which I think was the original aim of such Russian invasion. And this was also kind of shown by negotiations which were taking place with Zelensky and his representatives and Russian representatives, which were very close to reaching peaceful deal in March and beginning of April last year, 2022, but this peace deal, which was very close to being agreed, or had very good chances to be achieved, according to former Israeli Prime Minister and according to statements from Zelensky officials and from Russian officials and from Turkish officials. They both testified that there was a real possibility of such peaceful deal to be signed, but such agreement was broken by Western governments, specifically by US and United Kingdom, whose leaders decided to use this war to weaken Russia and use basically Ukraine as a proxy. And for this reason, this war continues. I think, again, and consequences for Ukraine will be very devastating, because it will not be able to defeat Russia, but suffer a lot of damage and a lot of human casualties and a lot of specific military casualties, which are biggest now and increasing very rapidly, and also because of other kind of consequences in terms of economic consequences, but also political consequences, which I mentioned, which will be in terms of, in case of end of such war, on the terms which would not be beneficial to Ukraine.
Ivan Katchanovski, I really thank you for your time. We could go on for another hour. Very much appreciated that you shared your wisdom with us. Thank you.